So it's my big honor to welcome Brian into this conversation from New York. Are you in New York?
At this exact moment, I'm just outside of Washington, D.C., but usually I live in New York.
Okay, yes. So welcome to this conversation. I'm going to do a super quick intro in Swedish and then we will switch over to English.
Sounds
Så
good.
välkomna till det här samtalet allihopa som vi har här på Kristna Regnbågsrörelsen Eko. Samtalet kommer att hållas på engelska och vi ska försöka prata långsamt och tydligt. Men har ni frågor så får ni jättegärna ställa dem i chatten. Astrid kommer att hålla koll och då går det att ställa frågorna både på engelska och på svenska. Och samtalet spelas in, men när det delas så kommer det bara vara jag och Brian som syns i bild. Så att ni håller er mutade så kommer ni inte synas på någon inspelning sen heller. Okay, did you catch any of that? We were talking about you knowing Danish a little bit.
Yeah, I was catching. I mean, it's I only know a little Danish, so very fast Swedish is even harder, but I caught a little bit of
I mean,
it.
I barely understand slow Danish. So, anyway,
Yeah,
welcome to this conversation. We are going to talk about this book or a little bit of what you know, but also about this book that you have released this fall. It's a little tricky to get to Sweden. I find out when I was going to order it, but Amazon does ship both the physical book to Sweden and you can get the ebook through Amazon as well. So I can highly recommend it. And Brian, I've followed you for a long time. I'm a little starstruck to like interact with you for real because I followed you for 10 years. I used to live in the United States. But for those of you who don't know you, do you want to introduce yourself a little bit and queerteology.com, which is yeah, the site that you work with and the podcast that you work with.
sure. I'm one half of the duo behind the partnership that started queertheology.com. At this point, I think it was maybe 12 years ago, and my friend and creative partner, Father Shannon Kearns, and I, at the time, were very frustrated that the conversation within Christianity and LGBT circles was very much centered on debating, is it okay to be LGBTQ and Christian? The sort of side A versus side B was very much all the rage. A
I think
lot of
you'll have to explain side A and side B
Sure.
because we don't really have that in Sweden.
So yeah, it's you're lucky. It's done. The idea was side A was fully affirming it's okay to be gay and in a gay relationship and to have like gay sex in the context of the gay relationship. And side B, which at that time was progress from thinking that you should have to change to become straight, was saying it's okay to have a gay orientation, to have gay attractions, but acting on that in any way was still sinful. And so you could say I'm gay and acknowledge that and that you didn't have to try to change that and become straight, but you couldn't ever act upon that. And my friend Shannon and I were just thought that that was not enough. That we, as LGBTQ people of faith, had so much more to offer the church and the world than always defining ourselves in opposition to, against what we were not. So rather than focusing on these handful of Bible passages that conservative Christians say condemn LGBT people, we wanted to look at all the different ways that queerness can enrich our faith and what new insights about God and our traditions might come up if we hold our queerness and our faith in conversation with one another. So we started by teaching a short course on how to read the Bible through from a queer perspective. That filled up, so we kept doing that. We started a podcast. We're now the longest running LGBTQ Christian and LGBTQ spirituality podcast. And we have an online community. We do online courses and workshops, and have a place to sort of come and discuss and be in fellowship together. And then relatedly, but somewhat separately, I'm also a relationship coach, and I work with folks to clarify and articulate your values and then build exciting sex lives and right fit relationships that are in line with those values. So that intersects very much with the conversation of faith oftentimes, but there are some folks that for them, living into their values doesn't looks like being outside of sort of organizational religion.
Do you want to say, because you're very open about who you are and how you identify as well, when you write and talk and in your book, do you want to say something just about that as well, so folks know
Sure.
who they're talking
Yeah.
to or
So
listening to?
in many ways, I have a very traditional relationship. My husband and I have been together since we were 23. I'm 40 now. So we've been together for, it'll be 17 years in January. I was his first boyfriend. He was my first boyfriend of more than just a few months. Obviously, at this point, we are now legally married. Um, so that's like one version of the story. Is I'm very, what we might say, like normie. Um, and then, but another version, or at the same time, we opened up our relationship maybe a year and a half into dating. And so we've had more boyfriends since we've been together than we had beforehand. At times, we've been long distance. We've each had other people in our lives that we care about very dearly. I've had a partner that I would call a boyfriend or a partner, sort of at the same time as my husband Peter. And yeah, we both, I think, identify both as being in an open relationship as well as personally being polyamorous. And so for me, my queerness and polyamory and faith are very much all interwoven together. And that is sort of the thrust of the book Love Beyond Monogamy.
We will get into that more, but if you want to start with just clarifying the terms, what is ethical? And ethical is being the word here,
Yeah.
non-monogamy, polyamory, and also open relationships, because you sort of separate those as well.
Yeah, they're very much related. Some people use them separately, some people use them somewhat interchangeably. So I'll start with polyamory. Polyamory is the interest or ability to have more than one sexual and or romantic relationship at the same time. And that can look any number of different ways. Oftentimes in the media, it's presented as a throuple. Oftentimes it's one man and two women, but it can look any number of different ways. Sometimes everyone is romantically engaged with one another. Sometimes they're engaged, they're dating or married or partnered more separately from one another. And that would fall under the umbrella of ethical non-monogamy, which is anything that's not monogamous. And so that could involve something more like an open relationship where the partnership of two people is still pretty central and it primary perhaps, and you have other entanglements, connections with other people, but oftentimes those are primarily sexual relationships, not necessarily dating or partnership. Um, though in my work, I see sometimes the line between a hookup and a friend with benefit and someone you're dating can be kind of blurry. And so oftentimes it's more so what people feel comfortable with, whether they identify as being in an open relationship or being polyamorous. I sometimes will look at people and say, well, I don't know, you seem to really care about this person. So it seems like you love multiple people, but it's not my job to tell you that you're polyamorous or not. Other types of non-monogamy, ethical non-monogamy might be swinging, which is it comes like more from the straight world, where both partners play together, usually at a party or people that they know. Oftentimes it'll be kind of called like wife swapping. Um, and that's like a whole subculture onto itself. Or solo polyamory, where you're interested in having multiple connections, but you don't consider any one of those to be your primary partner. That sort of like mimics a marriage type relationship. And then relationship anarchy would be a version of non-monogamy where you're each person in your life, you decide exactly what that relationship will look like. And like really every person. So not just people you're dating or married to or hooking up with, but also what does this friend relationship look like? What does this relationship with a family member or a coworker or a business partner look like? Really being intentional about defining all of those pieces of it rather than accepting that romance or a boyfriend or a wife gets bundled together with living together, having kids together, sharing finances together, going on vacations together, taking care of each other. You might have a friend that you want to live with or want to raise kids with, or you might have a partner that you don't want to live with. And so that's sort of another approach to ethical non-monogamy.
So many terms
Yeah.
for anyone being new, but that's a great overview. And so, why did you write this book about spirituality and polyamory?
Well, I for two reasons. One is that on a personal level, I found that my experience of polyamory taught me so much about the faith that I grew up with, the faith that I practiced, how I understood God, certainly. It also helped me understand things like the early Christian church better. It helped me understand Christian and spiritual and religious concepts like hospitality, love, commitment, sacrifice, fidelity in new and deeper ways. And so I wanted to be able to share those insights with folks that maybe were not polyamorous or non monogamous themselves, because I think each of us, through our own lived experiences and the identities that are important to us, that shapes how we understand God and our faith. And so we sort of need all the different pieces to understand God. As a white man, I experience God from one perspective, and so I need the voices of women and non-binary folks and people from the global south and Black and Indigenous and people who are HIV positive. We all bring different perspectives to God. And so this was one sort of angle and lens that I could bring to God that I could share with folks that maybe don't experience that personally. So that was one side of things. And then the other side was, I know that for many people, religion has been a stumbling block in their acceptance of themselves as an LGBT person, as a person who's having sex before marriage, as someone who is polyamorous, of all of the above. And so I wanted to speak a good word to how being queer, being sex positive, being non monogamous, being polyamorous, all those things were not just okay, but they were actually good and holy. And that feels important, even, I mean, especially for folks like us who are like people of faith in this room. But I found it just as important for people who are not necessarily religious or no longer identify as Christian, because humans, since the dawn of humanity, really have been storytellers. We've been, even before there are words, painting stories on cave walls. And stories are one of the primary ways that we as humans transmit our values and what's important to us and how we make meaning of ourselves and our communities and the world. And so many of the stories that we as LGBT people, as sexually active people, as polyamorous people have gotten is that there's something wrong with us, that it's disorder, that it's not as good as. And so I felt it was really important to tell new stories to say, actually, all the different ways that we form relationships and find connection are not just like okay, but they're good, and that they're holy even, and that's language that is available to us.
And how, for those of us who may feel a little burned by the church, and especially in terms of the polyamory area of our lives, uh, how can it be good in the eyes of faith, or what can we say to our church leaders to say that no, actually, this is holy?
Yeah, I mean that's like the whole question,
It's one
right?
question.
And sort of that I spend 60,000 words talking about that in the book. But I often come back to one of my guiding principles is in Matthew 7, Jesus talks about, there's going to be other people who come after me who proclaim all different kinds of messages about me, about God, about the good news, supposedly. And what you should do is look at the fruit that those trees bear to judge sort of the message behind them, the theology behind that. And I think that we can look at LGBT affirming theology and we can look at polyamory inclusive theology and see all of the ways in which that bears good fruit: connection, community, interdependence, authenticity, a sort of releasing of shame. And we can look at all of the ways in which anti-LGBT and anti-polyamory or sort of mandatory monogamy theology leads to self-harm, suicidal ideation, fracturing of families, sort of festering of shame, sort of pressuring people to keep their sex lives or sexuality, their relationships hidden and in the shadows. And when you do that, you can't be fully supported, can't be fully seen, can't be fully understood. And so we can see the sort of harmful fruits of that. So that's one sort of way in. And then the other way is through stories that we can argue what this word means in Leviticus or in Romans. We can argue, who Paul was talking to or what this code from the Torah means. And frankly, the Bible says lots of different things on a range of topics, but certainly when it comes to sex, the Hebrew Bible is filled with examples of lots of different types of non monogamy, some which maybe we would co-sign and many which we would find coercive or exploitative, sexist, and not something to emulate. Paul, in his letters or in one of his letters, talks about how the ideal is to stay single and celibate like him, and marriage is really only a last resort. And so there are lots of different ways, there are lots of different biblical marriages. And so it's our job to sort through all of that and look at the thrust of scripture and the ways in which the Spirit is still speaking today. And by telling our stories, you can't argue with that because our stories are our own. And so sharing in this book my own stories, the stories of clients and community members, and then inviting everyone who is non-monogamous in some way to share the stories of the ways in which God has shown up, not in spite of, but because of those relationships, in the midst of those connections, how the divine is working like in and amongst us. And that, as the UCC Church here in America says, like God is still speaking. And so, what new insights might we offer the wider church?
So, what are some of the insights that polyamorous can teach monogamous people?
Yeah. I mean, so I think many of us have heard that God is love, and that God loves us all, which I find to be a very beautiful message. We also, both in the Jewish Bible and in the Christian Bible, see a handful of, or a number of metaphors likening God's relationship with us to a marriage. Um, in the Jewish Bible, Song of Songs is often seen as a metaphor between not just these two people, but between God and God's people, God and Israel, God and all the world. Um, in Jewish tradition, when the Israelites received Torah at Mount Sinai, that is often kind of seen as a marriage type covenant. In modern congregations, and some modern congregations, when they celebrate that holiday, Shavuot, excuse me, there's sort of they'll make these marriage type contracts between God and God's people. Paul, I think it's in Ephesians, talks about marriage being a metaphor for God and God's people. And so we have all these ideas that God isn't some sort of like marriage with us, but like if God's love is limited, if marriage can only ever be between one other person, it necessarily means some things are reserved for some people and some people are outside of that covenant. And so I think that by looking at God through a lens of polyamory, it says actually God's love for you is not diminished by God's love for me. And that's something that we can understand, I hope, when it comes to God and when it comes to parents and their children, but it is not always something that is understood in the context of polyamory. And so polyamory really asks us to say, do we really believe that love is big enough, that love is abundant? Or do we believe that actually God loves some people more than others? I was visiting my childhood church a few years ago, which is evangelical, very conservative, and the pastor actually said God loves some people more than others, and I was so shocked. I wrote it down on the church bulletin because I wanted to later not ever convince myself that, oh, maybe you misremembered that. And so I think most people who would say polyamory is not okay hopefully wouldn't go that far, but that is sort of like one of the logical conclusions that this takes us to. And so that's like one area where we say, like, what does it really mean to have an abundant view of love in general and God's love for us? And so that's just like one of many sort of snippets from the book that I explore.
So, playing sort of the church leader, devil's advocate, sort of.
Yeah.
So, okay, so you talk about love, but
Hmm.
what about sex? Isn't it just about sex? And sometimes it is just about sex. And what about those instances?
Yeah, I actually the book talks a lot about sex because I think in polyamory discourse, even outside of Christian contexts, oftentimes there is sort of an impulse to say, no, it's not really about sex. Or if you hear about non-monogamy or open relationships or polyamory, you might be thinking about orgies or lots of sex with different people all of the time, but you really shouldn't think about that. You should think about love and commitment, and it just means like processing your feelings with even more people and having to have shared Google calendars to manage all of your plans. And like, yes, that is often part of it, and also sex is a part of it, and I don't want to downplay the sexual part of it. And so, yes, sex is good. God created us with bodies. God created us with sexualities. God created us with sexual desires. We see throughout the Bible and certainly in like Jewish and Christian tradition since the canonizing of the Bible, like sort of sexuality is infused through it, right? Even this idea of marriage as a metaphor between God and humanity, like in marriages, even in straight monogamous marriages, there's sex happening there. And so if the writers of the Bible are using marriage as a metaphor, it's inherently a sexually charged metaphor. And we can see the ways in which sexuality is used as a force of agency, sometimes as an agency of last resort, sometimes used in maybe not the best ways, but throughout the Bible. And a lot of the Christian saints sort of talk about God in very erotic ways. If you look at historical Christian artwork, a lot of it is quite erotic, sometimes explicitly sexual, and sometimes in a sort of more subtly erotic way. And so sex has always been a part of both the human experience and the religious experience. And I think that we don't have to shy away from that. We can actually lean into that. And when we think about all the ways, like how might God be present in our sex lives, and how might our sex lives like help us experience God more fully?
Um, so for those who may be a little new to all of this, how is all of this different than cheating?
Well, I mean, basically, it's not cheating because you all agreed to it, right? It is all above the board, decided in advance. And so you could cheat in the context of polyamory or non-monogamy if you're going against the agreements that you've made, either the types of relationships that you will or not have, or just disclosing or not disclosing your partnerships, or the types of decisions you make in dating or having sex with other people. And so, if anything, I think polyamorous people take commitment and fidelity quite seriously because we have detailed conversations about what does it mean to be committed? What does it mean to say we're boyfriends or we're partners or we're getting married if we can't just rely on, well, we won't have sex with other people or we'll get legally married and we'll just sort of let the world keep us together. What does commitment and faithfulness and success look like in our relationships? That's something that we have to define for ourselves. And as a relationship coach, I talk with lots of different people, many of whom are monogamous, and also just talking amongst friends or people in the queer theology community. People have a wide ranging definition of what monogamy means. Sometimes people in a monogamous relationship with each other have two different ideas of what monogamy means. And so it's really important whether you're open or polyamorous or monogamous to get clear on that because there's a whole lot of room for interpretation in there.
And so when speaking about polyamory, for those who may not fully understand it, one thing that often comes up is jealousy. And
Hmm.
I read you sent out like a newsletter thing like today or yesterday, whatever it was, that jealousy is one of your favorite feelings. So like just talk a little bit about jealousy in polyamorous relationships and what that means to you.
Yeah, I mean, it was a little bit of a cheeky hot take, but it's also partly true that jealousy, both in monogamous context and in non-monogamous context, can be seen as this like really terrible feeling and emotion. And so you have to do everything in your power to avoid ever even feeling it. And so if jealousy comes up, someone has done something wrong and should stop doing that thing. Or sometimes jealousy gets romanticized and said, "Look how jealous I am. That's how much my jealousy is an expression of how much I love you." Or my partner, he gets so jealous, like that must show how much he loves me, which that is a whole other tangent we could go on. But for me, and what I've seen in my work with clients and community members, is when folks are feeling jealous, it's usually a sort of flashing red light that there is an unmet need in themselves or in their relationships, that there's something that they're wanting more of or something that they're wanting less of. And so then jealousy becomes a signpost towards self and or relational development. And so instead of trying to stop whatever the thing is that prompted the initial jealousy feeling in the beginning, though that is also important to do. We want to not continually make ourselves feel activated, but it's not just enough to stop there and say, well, if I felt jealous because of this, you just stop doing that, and then we'll ignore it, because oftentimes jealousy is pointing the way towards wanting greater connection, feeling insecure in their relationship, not having solid communication skills, having some shame, having different expectations about what a relationship is or should be, what care for one another looks like. And so I always encourage folks to get curious about the jealousy and sort of see what's underneath it and not judge yourself for feeling it, but also not like and not neither indulging it nor trying to push it away, but saying what might this lead me to, and how can I do some like deeper work so that I don't feel jealous in the future.
And I was listening to a podcast that you did about this book, and you talked a lot about you be doing values-centric work.
Mm-hmm.
Could you share a little bit more what you mean about that?
Yeah, I think that when faith at its best is a reminder of the things that we value the most. Paul Tillich talks about God as sort of one's ultimate concern. Um, Again, with stories being a way in which we communicate and transmit what is important to us and what we value. And so um, our faith hopefully reminds us and inspires us of the things that are important to us. And at the times where we might feel tempted to give into our more selfish, more tribal, more combative impulses, our faith can be, and the practices of our faith and the communities of faith can remind us, no, actually, God is calling us to something bigger, or humanity is at its best when we are in service of each other. Um, and also, our faith is oftentimes a reflection of our values. That yes, they can remind me, my faith practices like remind me of that, but I'm probably like not going to take on a religious tradition that has completely alien values to me. And so there is a little bit of they reinforce one another. And so I talk about values in part as a way for folks who no longer consider themselves religious to see the value in the value, to see how orienting one's life around some intentionally chosen things that are important to them, guiding principles. And when we make decisions from the place of that which we value the most, our lives are more in alignment. And it's also a helpful word framework for religious folks to sort of peel back. It's really easy to sort of get stuck in the way Christianity should look. And yes, church, reading the Bible, the rituals of baptism and communion, and all of that are important. And also, like, what do they point towards and what do they draw you towards? And it's possible that there are two different people who identify as Christian but have wildly different values. We certainly see that here in the U.S. The fundamentalist Christians call themselves Christians, and Father Shannon, my creative partner, who is a transgender old Catholic priest, mainline Christians fighting for justice and equality and liberation, all under the name of Christianity. So it's not just enough to say I'm Christian. What exactly do you mean by that? And I find that distilling down beyond just the sort of the superficial labels of it's important to be a Christian, it's important to live by the Bible, it's important to listen to the Holy Spirit. Great, those are all lovely ideals. But like, let's put some more specificity around that so we can know what we mean and then also let that inform how we move forward.
Is that something that we can use in sort of our activism or conversations with the church leaders or the church in order to be more LGBTQ and polyamory friendly?
I think so. One of the exercises that I have folks do if they're part of our soulful sexuality class or cohort inside of the queer theology community, or if they work with me as a one-on-one client in my coaching practice, is to get clear on what your values are and what your most important values are, and then make explicit connections between that and how you live out your faith or your spiritual life and how you live out your sex and relational lives, to show that these are actually really connected to one another. And I think it's a useful practice for individuals to clarify what their values are and to be a little honest with oneself about the values that I want to be what I
Mm.
value and some of the things that I do value, even if maybe I think that I shouldn't, or maybe I judge myself a little for that. I was working with a client recently, and he talked about his values as being loyalty and honesty and trust, and a few other sort of lofty sounding values. And I was like, okay, well, what values maybe do you have that you value that maybe you're don't sound as noble? And he was like, well, yeah, like I think I value physical attractiveness and I value physical fitness, which I think he can see as maybe being in his mind a little bit superficial, but also it's important to know actually, at least right now, that's something that I value. And then he can choose, do I embrace those values and feed those values, or do I sort of choose to emphasize other values? Um, when we think about religious rituals as reinforcing our values, and in the book, I have a little section about how lots of things outside of traditional religion can sort of take on religious attitude. And an example that I use is sports, and in particular American baseball, as having sort of the elements of religiosity. But one of the values that sports in particular promotes is a value of competition. And there are some people in America, in the world, who would say like, yes, actually competition is an important value, and I'm not ashamed to say that I promote that value. I might value collaboration instead of competition. And so if you're a person or a group of friends or an organization or denomination, do you value competition? Do you value collaboration? Do you value justice? Do you value fairness? Do you value exclusivity? Some people value exclusivity. And so starting with the values and then saying, okay, well, if we really believe these things, how then do they play out in our personal lives, in our relational lives, in our organizational lives? And what in the context of LGBT people and polyamory, like how do those fit in or not fit into these values frameworks?
So for those of us who may be allies in terms of to polyamory or non or ethical non-monogamy, uh, how can we best be allies in this world that values monogamy so much?
That is a great question. I think there's a few different approaches that I would take. There's one that's just sort of a sense of having an attitude of curiosity, and so taking it upon oneself to read books like Love Beyond Monogamy, but also there's lots of books about polyamory and non-monogamy, to watch YouTube videos or vlogs or follow people on Instagram who are talking about non-monogamy or sharing their life as a throuple, just to sort of vary your examples of what is possible when it comes to a relationship, and to not just have like, oh well, I came to the Zoom with Brian, so I check that off. That's my one thing that I'm gonna do.
Mm.
But there's more to polyamory than just me, right? And so podcasts, books, movies, sort of consuming media about polyamory, both within a faith context and outside of it, just to have a better understanding of it. And that way you don't put the polyamorous or non-monogamous people in your life don't have to become your personal tutors, but also, in ways that are appropriate to your level of friendship and intimacy with them, ask questions and stay curious about their lives and their relationships. And especially if you might ask them a question about their personal life if they were monogamous, don't not ask that because they're polyamorous. That I think sometimes people imagine that like just the existence of polyamory is somehow like inherently sexual, and so that's somehow inherently like inappropriate to talk about in public or in a workplace or around kids. But if you would ask, how's your wife doing, you can ask like, how are both of your partners doing? If you would introduce your child to their uncle and his husband, you can introduce your child to his uncle and his husband's girlfriend. And that isn't inherently something devious. Um, and then on just a practical level, especially if you're in a position of leadership at a church or in an organization, or if you're having a party of some sort and you're like with an official guest list, I'm just like being mindful of the language you use to talk about families.
Mm.
Um, can it Are there ways that you can just sort of make it more inclusive of lots of different types of relationship structures? And this is one of the areas where this sort of mindfulness helps more than just polyamorous people, because there are lots of different ways that people form families, even if they don't identify as polyamorous. They might have blended families with exes who are still parental figures, still part of their lives. They might have children that are not related to them either because they came into their lives through marriage or through adoption, single parents, grandparents who are the primary or sole caregivers of grandchildren, roommates who live together and take care of each other well into old age. And so those are all examples of love beyond monogamy, but that aren't polyamorous or even non-monogamous in nature. And so being mindful of language and who gets invited, and if you're inviting a person and one of their partners, is there like a reason why, and you know that they have multiple partners, is there a reason why you're only inviting two of them? Is there space to invite more of them? Could you leave it up to the person you're closest with to decide who in their lives they want to bring? I know that for many polyamorous folks, like weddings and plus ones or weddings addressed to one partner can be a really sort of a touchy spot of when people try to decide for you which relationships are most important or continually block out certain people in your life. And obviously, weddings are expensive. I'm not saying you have to invite five people
Mm.
instead of just two, but just be mindful about that. Could your friend who's getting plus ones or plus twos? How is that decided? Who's on the invite list? Who gets left out? Or even to things like a Christmas party, right? If you're inviting a handful of friends, being mindful of if you're extending the invitation to one partner, are you making it clear that they're welcome to bring their other partners, or is it closed for some reason, and just sort of owning those decisions that you make rather than defaulting to I'm going to only ever or like primarily acknowledge or primarily include the partner that you live with, the partner that you've been together longest with, the partner that you seem to spend the most time with, the partner that you're legally married to. There might be other people in that person's lives that are also important to them, and to show care and concern and curiosity about those partners as well will go a really a long way.
So in the very like in the early pages of this book, like in the introduction, you talk about welcoming a stranger into our midst, which is like so central in lots of religions, and especially including Christianity for
Yeah,
sure.
yeah.
And you're right. What does welcoming a stranger into a bedroom have to teach us about hospitality? And I want to ask that question, but I also want to add, like, in terms of like inviting people into not only our bedroom, but our homes, into our relationships, like, so also into our bedrooms, but also expand that question a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, as you pointed out, hospitality is really central to Christianity. It pops up again and again, both in the Jewish Bible and in the Christian Bibles. Um, and I mean, it's a little like provocative on purpose, but inviting strangers into our bedrooms is really a radical act of hospitality, right? I think about people who have one night stands, in particular, like I'm a queer man, and so that's my personal experience of like going on the internet and on an app and meeting a total stranger and inviting them into my home at 9 p.m. or 2 a.m. Like you put a profound amount of trust in another person, that sometimes I think, one night stands or late night hookups get painted as like these like sordid and shameful things. And I don't know. I feel like I trust people that I've met on Grindr more than some church members treat new people who come to visit on a Sunday morning to their services. And so, like, if
Mhm.
I can be trusting of these people, how might that then empower and inspire me to be more trusting of like the newcomer at church or the person asking for money on the street corner or the immigrant who wants to move into my neighborhood? I don't think that like one night stands is going to magically change our whole orientation to all of the world's problems. And also, it was sort of one example of can you find your growing edge and the places where you're able to already trust or be welcoming and sort of use that as inspiration to step just a little bit outside of your comfort zone and to remember like, well, if I can trust over here in this area, maybe I can trust over there in this other area. And I tell the story in the book in a later chapter, where there's the story of Jacob, sort of the Jacob wrestling with God story. And so Jacob has been estranged from his brother. They're about to reunite. And so Jacob sends his whole family, all of his servants, their whole encampment. They pack everything up. They send them across the river to go ahead. And Jacob, for whatever reason, like lingers back. He doesn't go with them. And then night falls and this strange man appears in the woods, like by the riverbank, and they wrestle with each other. They have this like physical tussle. The text says it goes all night, all the night until daybreak. And at one point, this strange man like jams his thumb into the spot, like his hip socket, right? Like right above, so like in the spot, like right above his groin. It's this very sort of vulnerable, intimate place. Um, and it reminds me of people cruising for sex in parks late at night. I wonder, like, did Jacob know that this God man stranger was coming? Did they prearrange it? Was this a spot where people were known to encounter one another? Nothing about the encounter in the text indicates that it was a non-consensual tussle, like wrestling. They were just sort of like wrestling together, and it left him limping afterwards. And I can think of the times in which I've had a particularly vigorous round of sex that has like left me out of breath or sore or limping or with a scratch mark. And Jacob has this limp that is a reminder of this blessing that he got. And so seeing these sort of parallels there is also like a reminder again of the ways in which even the sexy parts of our non-monogamous or our queer lives contain insights into the divine. Um, and when you sort of pair that with over and over again, there's these stories of the importance of welcoming strangers. Sodom and Gomorrah was destroyed because of the way that they treated their strangers. In Hebrews, I got it. Like Hebrews 13 says, do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unaware. This idea that the strangers are angels. And so, yeah, I mean, I think we see that over Abraham welcomes strangers. that like what if instead of seeing these encounters with new folks as being shameful, there are ways in which we entertain angels. And I think that that's what the Bible says. And I don't know that the Bible necessarily imagines it in this context, but also the Bible is full of lots of sex. And so I don't think that we have to split ourselves into and say like, well, when I entertain strangers in this way, it's good, and when I entertain strangers in this way, it's bad. That they're all it's all wrapped up together. And you can have I've had really meaningful, transcendent even experiences with people whose names I didn't know yet, whose names I did know, but like our relationship didn't extend much beyond outside of the bedroom. That like God is there in the midst of that also. And that again, I can sort of take those experiences outside of the bedroom and use that to shape how I show up in my life amongst my friends, in my community, in my neighborhoods, in my churches, in the synagogues, to say like love is bigger, we can trust more, we can risk more, we can take care of one another in big ways and in small ways. And yeah, so these become little like microcosms for like the bigger vision.
For those of us who may have a very hard time seeing our bodies and sexualities and sex as holy or a God being in the midst of that, do you have any like, I know that's a big question. I know you have whole courses on it, which like I
Yeah.
recommend, but like, do you have like, where do we start if that feels hard?
I think I have an intellectual answer and an embodied answer. And so I think the intellectual answer is to to go back and reread the parts of the Bible that talk about the importance of bodies, right? That the word became flesh, that for Christians we believe that like the incarnation is one of the central things about the Christian faith. In the Hebrew Bible, how we use our bodies, what our bodies do, how to take care of our bodies. That's really bodies are important in both the Jewish Bible and in the Christian Bible. And so we see a concern that God has, that our bodies are taken care of, that they're fed, that they're nourished, that they're healed. Um, Jesus comes to heal bodies, right? And so we can see throughout Scripture this sort of emphasis on bodies being important. And that has been there are also parts, right, where Paul has weird thoughts about his own body. There are parts of the Christian Bible that talk about playing down the importance of the body, that the body's being temporary vessels and temptation. Um, so I don't want to like ignore that those parts of the Bible, but to remind folks that the Bible is a collection of stories and books. It's a library more than one set book, and that they are all in conversation with one another. And oftentimes contradicting one another or arguing one another. And that doesn't mean that it's not true. That's like part of the process. Genesis 1 and 2 tell two different orders of creation, and yet they're both included. Um, the Torah and some of the later writings in the Jewish Bible take different approaches on whether we should welcome and embrace the outsider, or whether the outsider should be kept at arm's length or even maybe excluded. Um, Jesus is wrestling with his Jewish faith. The early church in Acts is like wrestling with Jesus. The church beyond the canon is wrestling with the Bible, right? This wrestling and holding things in tension is part of it. And so just because you can point to this verse or that verse that says some negative thing about your body, there's also all of these parts in the Bible about the importance of bodies. And so remembering that like God cares about your body. And so then if we can start there, to pay attention to your actual body, to take it out of your head and into your body. And so starting with simple things like, well, listening to my body about what I might want to eat today in this moment. Is it something sweet? Is it something sour? Is it something crunchy? Paying attention to the temperature of your body. Do you want to be warmer or cooler? Even like when you shower, like how does it feel showering facing this way or showering facing that way? If you have a like, can you like let the water pressure be on your head, be on your shoulder, like be on your back? Feeling different types of texture and just sort of like really paying attention to the sensations of your body and the feelings that that brings up in you and what you also desire, paying attention to your desire, as well as being an important part of that. And this is such important work because um, all have bodies and we all have desires. And Um, I quote in this book a person who wrote, probably half a century ago about religious authorities and political authorities realize that we all have bodies and desires. And so if they can tell us that our sexuality and our bodies and our desires are bad and we should suppress them, and then that is impossible for basically everyone, then we feel shame that we sort of failed at this thing that we've been told to do. And if we feel shamed, it's easier to control us because the quote says something to the effect of, like self-respect is a key component for sort of a man to have or a person to have like self-determination and resistance. And so if they can convince us to ignore our intuition, ignore what our bodies are telling us, and believe that our bodies and our desires are shameful, it then makes it harder for us to stand up for what we know to be right because we've sort of lost track of that still small voice of God within inside of us. And so, yes, it's about tuning into your desire and your bodies so that you have better sex and more fun relationships. But it's also so that you can say, like, I know this to be true about my body, and I also know it to be true that the way that we're treating immigrants in this country is not right. I know that the way that you're talking about trans people is not right. I know that it's important to stand up for the rights of XYZ group. And so it feels very much interconnected. Like, yes, it's about healing our relationship with our bodies and our sexualities, and it's also so that we can show up in all aspects of our life to do the work of creating the kingdom of God on earth as it is in heaven.
That's beautiful. I just want to remind everyone we are very near to the end of our conversation. So if you do have a question for Brian, write it in the chat. Now is your time. You can write it in Swedish if you want. And Brian, maybe we've talked a little bit about this, but if you want to add something for those who want to start exploring life as poly and a person of faith, what what do you have to say? Like, where do we start?
Yeah, well, you can start by reading Love Beyond Monogamy. Um, yeah, and also if it comes to books to read, The Ethical Slut. I don't know if there's a Swedish version, but it's considered the Bible of polyamory. I talk about The Ethical Slut as a sacred text in my book. Um, and that's much more like practical how to. But I think that the first step would be to get clear on what you're interested in and why you're interested, and again, how that connects to your values, so that you're coming at it from a grounded place of, this is important to me because autonomy, trust, exploration, curious, because like I think I might be interested and I want to like say yes to like following up on the things that I'm unsure about. Um, if you're single or dating or entering into a new relationship, I might have different advice for you than if you're in an existing monogamous relationship and you're wanting to open that up. That might be like a different process, but first starting with clarifying your values and how this is connected to that journey, and then being in communication with if you're the people in your life, if you're in a relationship, talking to them about it. If you're looking for support, talking to a therapist or a coach, or getting a part of a community, listening to podcasts just to sort of learn more and get some language. And then my final suggestion on that would be that when you first hear about it, it can be sort of like a kid in a candy store of like, oh my God, I had no idea this was even possible. And I just like want to gobble it all up. Or Paul, I sort of felt like this when Paul and the scales fall off his eyes. And he's like, oh, I can see now. And you sort of like see the whole world in a whole new way. And it can sometimes feel difficult to unsee it, right? Like I can't imagine ever seeing the world through a different paradigm. And so your partner or your family or your friends or your church, like they might not have had this awakening yet. And so, not that you need to endlessly contort yourself to fit their idea of what you should be, but also to recognize that they're also going to go on their own journey, and um, to be patient and go slowly, especially if you're in an existing relationship that you have like your whole life ahead of you. You don't have to go from monogamous to polyamorous in 3 weeks, right? You can take your time, but to continue taking action, that I find a, a breeding ground of problems is when folks are like, oh, I'll get to it someday, or we're like, we just need to like figure it out eventually, and it's sort of always in the background. Even if what you decide is, I'm going to be monogamous still, it's important to sort of make that be a choice you decide rather than a decision that you keep sort of putting off.
Mhm. And so the final question then, your undertitle to Love Beyond Monogamy
Hmm.
is how polyamory can enrich your spirituality, faith, and relationships. So, how? Like if you want to like I understand one should read the book, but like is there anything like to neatly summarize it and
Yeah, I
maybe
mean, I think
a
that like
teacher?
yeah, I think like everything that we've talked about thus far over the course of the past, hour or so in this call, all of those are different ways in which um, that they can enrich your spirituality, your faith, and your relationships. And I think the sort of like the two through lines are, um, or maybe three, that um, that intentionally choosing whether it's your relationship structure or your faith practices or who you're going to be with, your job even, like that this act of intentionally choosing rather than running on default is going to enrich all areas of your life. That this is true of monogamous relationships, that the best relationships, the healthiest relationships, have ongoing practices, perhaps even rituals that support them. Because polyamory is sort of a marginalized identity, and because the nature of polyamory involves managing lots of different relationships, I think we're more likely than monogamous folks to have conversations about ourselves and our relationship and what we want and sort of build out those intentionally. But having rituals that support your relationships and your spirituality and your faith are really important. That's a through line of this book. And then sort of the closing thought is that when I was imagining this book, I thought I'm going to write a book about polyamory and spirituality. And I wrote out the proposal and I called it Love Beyond Monogamy. And then I got a book deal and then I wrote the book. And I was like, yeah, I wrote a book about polyamory and spirituality. And then one of my friends was reading an early copy of it. And they called me and they were like, I just love that this book is just all about love. It's about the power of love and how love is bigger. And I was like, oh, yeah, I was fixated on the like monogamy versus polyamory part, but it really is love in all of its forms, beyond monogamy in all of its forms. And that love really is bigger, deeper, wider than you imagined it could be, and to sort of to lean into the power of love to transform your spirituality, faith, and relationships.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Brian, for taking the time to talk to us in Sweden. It was so enriching, and everyone should uh, go to Amazon. Is the only site that I found that is Sweden friendly.
Yeah.
But there you can get both an ebook or the physical copy. And follow Brian on social media or wherever. Where do you want people to follow you?
Yeah,
For theology.
I'm this is BGM at all the in all the places. I'm most active on Instagram and Threads. But also this is bgm.com, YouTube, this is BGM, all the places. And then queerteology.com is a resource hub and online community for queerness and spirituality. And we have a podcast and courses. And so queertheology.com, or we're either queer theology or Q theology, depending on the platform. And we're active on all those places as well.
And I can really recommend it and also like follow your newsletter through Queer Theology. Like one or a few times a week, I get a little nice email with a reflection from either you or Father Che, and it's wonderful to read and to enrich my life. So thank you so much for this conversation, and thank you everyone for tuning in. I really enjoyed it, and I hope that you did too. So thank you.
Thanks for having me.